When Donald Trump mocked Barack Obama's Harvard law degree, the room burst into laughter. But what happened next silenced the crowd and left Trump struggling to catch his breath. It happened in a packed convention hall in Phoenix, Arizona, where the air, thick with the smell of popcorn and populist fervor, was already charged with a volatile, unspoken tension. Before Trump even touched the microphone, a low, anxious hum vibrated through the floor. The collective energy of thousands waiting for a spark. Cameras, like patient vultures, panned across the sea of faces. They captured the flushed cheeks and zealous eyes of those in bright red caps, their faith in their leader absolute. They lingered on the skeptics, arms crossed and expressions guarded, drawn in by the gravitational pull of a political phenomenon they couldn't ignore. And they found the students, phones already held high, ready to document what they instinctively knew would be a night of raw, unfiltered history. Everyone knew one thing. This wasn't going to be an ordinary night. Then, with that familiar mix of confidence and bravado, Trump strode to the podium. He absorbed the roar of the crowd, a grin spreading across his face as he gestured to them, a conductor taking command of his orchestra. He leaned into the mic, a deliberate, theatrical gesture that commanded absolute silence, and said the line that would set off one of the most talked-about moments of the year. "Barack Obama," he began, letting the name hang in the air like a challenge, the crowd stirring with a low growl of disapproval. He paused, letting the animosity build. "Harvard law degree?" he said, his voice dripping with theatrical contempt. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound that was both a dismissal and an invitation. "Give me a break. Everybody knows it's overrated. The man probably never even deserved it." The dam broke. A tidal wave of laughter crashed through the convention hall. It was not a gentle, amused chuckle. It was a raw, cathartic explosion of derision. A group in the front row slapped their knees, their faces red with glee, as if this was the punchline they had been waiting years to hear. The sound rolled through the room like a physical force, loud, sharp, and almost cruel. For a second, it looked like Trump had won the moment completely. His grin stretched from ear to ear as he gestured toward the cameras, a showman savoring his applause. But that's when the camera cut to Barack Obama, standing calmly off to the side of the stage. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood there with the same quiet, unshakable presence that had made him a household name long before he ever set foot in the White House. The calmness wasn't weakness. It was a coiled spring, a figure of impossible stillness in a sea of chaos. The laughter began to falter, starting in the back rows where people could see the split screen on the giant monitors. The raucous guffaws died in their throats, replaced by a confused murmur. A woman in the 10th row leaned over to her husband, her voice a tense whisper. "Oh, he's not smiling." Trump might have just made a very big mistake. The atmosphere in the hall inverted, the gleeful energy evaporating, replaced by a heavy electric suspense. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. The laughter that answered Trump was not a polite ripple of amusement. It was a physical force, a weaponized sound that he had expertly aimed and fired. It was the collective roar of a movement that felt validated, the cathartic release of years of pent-up resentment against an establishment they believed Obama embodied. Trump bathed in it, a conductor reveling in a perfectly executed crescendo. He basked in it, his grin stretching from ear to ear as he gestured to the cheering crowd, a ringmaster acknowledging his roaring lions. He had them. He owned them. In that moment, he was invincible, powered by their collective scorn. The cameras drank it all in, the laughing faces, the triumphant posture of the former president, the sheer, unadulterated energy of a moment he had perfectly crafted for maximum impact. But then, in the control booth high above the floor, a director made a decision that would pivot the night on a dime. The camera cut away from Trump's triumphant face. It panned slowly, deliberately, to the side of the stage. There, on the edge of the stage, stood Barack Obama. He was an anchor of stillness in a sea of chaotic glee. He didn't cross his arms in defiance or scowl in anger. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands loosely at his sides. It wasn't the absence of a reaction. It was a reaction in itself. A deliberate, powerful choice to absorb the blow without flinching, to let the insult hang in the air and decay under its own weight. The change in the room was not immediate, but it was undeniable. It began as a slow bleed of sound from the back, where audience members watching the giant monitors were the first to see the split screen. Trump's gloating face on one side, Obama's profound calm on the other. The wave of laughter crested, broke, and then receded, leaving behind a shoreline of awkward, sputtering coughs and confused murmurs. A man who had been howling with laughter just moments before now found his smirk frozen on his face, his eyes darting between the stage and the screen. The sound of 10,000 people collectively realizing they might be on the wrong side of history is a strange and unsettling thing. A woman sitting halfway back whispered to her friend, her eyes fixed on the giant screen, "He's not gonna let that slide. Watch. He's about to handle him." The friend leaned in, nodding, her gaze locked on Obama. The laughter from moments before now felt cheap, almost embarrassing. The atmosphere in that Phoenix Hall didn't just feel different. It felt inverted. The gleeful, light-hearted mockery had evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. It was the collective breath-holding of a crowd bracing for an impact far greater than a punchline. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, and it was unnervingly quiet. The silence that followed the laughter was not empty. It was a physical presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on every person in the hall. The dying embers of laughter left a bitter, metallic taste in the air. Trump, a man who thrived on noise and perpetual motion, stood alone in that vacuum. He was a performer whose audience had suddenly forgotten their lines, and his discomfort was palpable. He shifted on his feet, the confident smirk on his face tightening into something brittle and forced. His eyes, which usually commanded the room, now darted nervously between the silent crowd and the still figure of his opponent. He was a hunter who had fired his best shot, only to watch it dissolve into thin air, and now the jungle had gone unnervingly quiet. Into this void, Obama moved. He didn't rush to the microphone to counterattack. He took 3 deliberate steps forward, his movements economical and precise, each footfall seeming to draw more energy and attention out of the air. His hand brushed the microphone stand, a light, almost casual touch, as if steadying an object that was already perfectly still. His very presence seemed to recalibrate the room, his stillness a powerful counter-frequency to the chaotic energy Trump had unleashed. The audience leaned forward as one, a collective, silent inhale. They weren't just waiting for a response, they were waiting for a verdict. When Obama finally spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was not filled with rage or indignation. It was calm, measured, and carried a tone of almost academic curiosity, as if he were examining a peculiar specimen. "You know, Donald," he began, the words cutting through the hall not like a sledgehammer, but like a scalpel. "I've heard a lot of strange things over the years." He paused, letting the weight of that simple observation settle over the crowd. "But doubting my Harvard law degree, that's a new one." The delivery was a masterclass in control. It was so devoid of anger that it was profoundly disarming. It didn't meet the insult head-on. It sidestepped it, held it up to the light, and quietly labeled it as something bizarre, something unworthy of a serious emotional response. The quietness of his reply was more deafening than any roar could have been. You could physically feel the audience shift. The few remaining smirks vanished. The people who had been roaring with laughter moments before now sat stiffly, their eyes wide, a palpable sense of embarrassment creeping through the rows. In the press section, a veteran journalist scribbled furiously, underlining a single word. composure. Trump tried to recover, forcing a chuckle and waving his hand dismissively. But the gesture looked weak, a clumsy attempt to swat away a ghost. The power dynamic had been completely inverted without a single raised voice. The surgeon had made his first incision, and the room was left in stunned, breathless silence. Trump, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, scrambled to reclaim it with the brute force of his most trusted weapon. Populist grievance. The unnerving quiet was his enemy. He needed the roar back. He leaned hard into the microphone, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced, a flicker of desperation betraying his confident posture. "Oh, come on," he blustered, shaking his head as if addressing a room full of children. "We all know how it works. People get pushed through Harvard all the time. Political connections, special treatment. It's a rigged system." He was trying to frame Obama's achievement not as a product of merit, but as a symptom of the very elite corruption his base despised. A few hollow cheers answered him from the front rows, a reflex from his most devoted followers. But the sound didn't travel. In the third row, the young man in the Dallas Cowboys cap, who had been laughing so heartily just minutes before, turned to his friend and muttered, "That sounds defensive." He wasn't the only one. The audience was no longer a monolith. It was fractured, listening with a new, critical ear. But Obama didn't take the bait. He didn't get bogged down in a factual debate about his admission or his grades. That would be defensive, a retreat onto Trump's chosen battlefield. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He widened the lens, transforming a personal insult into a universal principle. He stood with his hands resting casually on the podium, his posture radiating an unshakable calm that was in itself a statement. "Donald," he said, his voice now carrying a note of profound seriousness, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "When you try to tear down education, you're not just talking about me." The hall fell even quieter. He made eye contact with a group of young people near the back, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. "You're talking about every kid who dreams of being the first in their family to graduate. You're talking about every single mother who stays up late studying after her children are asleep, hoping that hard work might finally change their life." He let the words sink in, each one a seed planted in the minds of thousands. "You can try to laugh at me," he concluded, his voice resonating with quiet power. "But when you laugh at education, you laugh at them too." The effect was instantaneous and profound. A smattering of applause broke out in the back, sharp, defiant claps that cut through the silence. It wasn't the roaring approval of a rally. It was something more meaningful. It was the sound of conviction. The applause grew, spreading from the back rows to the sides like a fire catching, a grassroots reaction that the front rows couldn't ignore. Trump lifted a hand dismissively. "Typical politician," he sneered, "trying to make it about everybody else. I'm talking about you, Barack." But his words were clipped and weak against the rising tide of support for his opponent. People were choosing sides in real time. Obama had done more than defend his degree. He had become the defender of the American dream itself, casting Trump not as a populist hero, but as a cynic, tearing down the very ladder people used to climb. Trump, now visibly on the back foot and losing the moral high ground, scrambled for a line that would stick. He retreated to his strongest territory, the tangible world of money and steel versus the abstract world of ideas. He leaned into his microphone, his smirk returning, though it looked more like a grimace, a mask of confidence slipping just enough to show the strain beneath. "You think you're better than everyone else because of a piece of paper from Harvard?" he challenged, his voice rising, hoping to reignite the class resentment that had so often fueled his political fire. "I made billions. I built skyscrapers. I didn't need Harvard to build an empire." A few cheers erupted from his core supporters, a reflex of loyalty, but they were scattered, islands of noise in a vast sea of quiet contemplation. The line that usually brought the house down now felt hollow, a boast from a past battle that no longer applied to the current war. Obama let the statement hang in the air, allowing its arrogance to curdle. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he watched, his expression almost professorial, as if he were about to patiently correct a student's fundamental misunderstanding. He waited for the scattered cheers to die out, letting the silence that followed amplify the weight of what he was about to say. Then he leaned forward, his voice calm and precise. "You know, Donald, I didn't just attend Harvard. I didn't just graduate." He paused, a masterful beat that drew every eye in the room to him, a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the stage lights. "I was elected president of the Harvard Law Review." The words landed not with a bang, but with the deadening thud of an undeniable fact. He didn't say it with arrogance. He delivered it as a simple, irrefutable statement of a qualification earned, not given. Before Trump could even formulate a dismissal, Obama translated its significance for everyone in the room. "That doesn't happen because of connections," he said, looking directly at Trump, subtly dismantling his earlier jab. "It doesn't happen because somebody hands it to you. It happens when you argue, debate, and write so effectively that you earn the respect of some of the most competitive, brilliant legal minds in the country. It happens because you earn it." The room stirred. You could hear audible gasps. A few people began to clap instinctively before stopping themselves, as if unsure if they were allowed to applaud such a direct hit. But then the dam broke, and a wave of solid, respectful applause rolled through the hall. It was the sound of an audience acknowledging a point that could not be spun or dismissed. Trump tilted his head, forcing that smirk again, but the camera caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Law review, big deal," he scoffed into his mic, trying to minimize the blow. "Who even reads that stuff? Nobody." But the dismissal sounded petty and weak. He was a brawler who had just swung at a fortress, and the only thing he had bruised were his own knuckles. Having intellectually dismantled Trump's attack, Obama sensed the moment required more than facts. The fortress of his credentials was unbreachable, but now he needed to open the gates and show the human story inside. The stern, focused intensity in his eyes softened. His shoulders relaxed further, and his voice, which had been sharp and precise, now took on a warmer, more reflective tone. It was as if he were no longer addressing a political opponent in a convention hall, but sharing a deeply personal memory with a room full of confidants. The audience felt the shift instantly. They leaned in, not with the tense anticipation of a fight, but with the quiet reverence of those about to hear a story that mattered. "I remember nights when I was studying constitutional law," he began, his gaze drifting over the crowd, past the cameras, as if looking back in time. "I can still smell the old books and the stale coffee. My classmates and I would be in the library until 2 or 3 in the morning, under those harsh fluorescent lights, until our eyes burned. We'd fall asleep with our books open, our faces pressed against the pages, and wake up with the ink imprinted on our cheeks." He wasn't talking about prestige or privilege anymore. He was talking about the universal grind of hard work. "We weren't born into wealth," he continued, his voice softening further. "We didn't have the luxury of shortcuts or family fortunes to fall back on. We carried the weight of student loans and the heavier weight of our family's hopes. We knew, deep in our bones, that if we wanted to change our lives, we had to fight for every single inch. That degree wasn't a trophy. It was a promise fulfilled. That is what my degree represents." The story landed like a quiet truth, bypassing political defenses and striking a deeply human chord. In the second row, a man in his 50s, a factory worker by the look of his rough hands, shifted uncomfortably, his own memories of sacrifice rising to the surface. A woman in her 60s, sitting near the aisle, blinked back tears, her husband placing a reassuring hand on her arm. The narrative had shifted from a political debate to a testament of the human spirit. Trump, seeing this emotional connection being forged, a bond he could not break with bluster, tried to shatter the moment with crude sarcasm. Yeah, we've all heard your speeches before," he interrupted, his voice laced with contempt. "Spare us the bedtime story. The country needs strength, not a violin solo." The interjection was jarring and profoundly miscalculated. Instead of making Obama look weak, it made Trump look callous and small. Obama turned slightly toward him, a flicker of a sad smile on his face, as if pitying a man who could only see strength in volume. "Strength isn't about how loud you shout, Donald," he replied calmly, his voice a steady anchor in the turbulent room. "Strength is finding the discipline to keep going when you're exhausted. Strength is staying steady when people are trying to tear you down. That's the kind of strength I believe in." That line landed like a hammer blow. The applause that followed was thunderous, unified, and deeply personal. It wasn't just for a politician. It was for the idea he now embodied, that true strength is forged in quiet sacrifice, not in loud proclamations. The philosophical chasm between the two men was now wide open, a vast canyon of worldview and values. Trump, desperate to return to solid ground, retreated to the tangible, to the steel and concrete legacy he saw as unassailable. He jabbed a finger toward Obama, his voice booming in an attempt to project a strength he no longer commanded. "So what? You sat around reading books and talking," he boomed, casting himself as the man of action versus the man of empty words. "I built things. Real things. I built towers that changed the skyline. I created jobs. You just talked." It was his signature attack, a line polished by 1,000 rallies, and it was met with a few hearty cheers from the faithful, who saw the world in the same black and white terms. They were the last echoes of the room's initial energy, a fading reminder of the control he once held. But the rest of the hall was silent, waiting. Obama didn't retreat from the charge. He advanced into it, meeting the argument head-on, not with anger, but with a faint, almost pitying smile, as if Trump's line had only reinforced his own point. "Donald, I respect anyone who works hard," he began, the words a disarming gesture of grace that immediately lowered the room's defenses. "Construction workers, teachers, nurses, they all build something real every single day." The crowd nodded, drawn in by the inclusive tone. "But let's be very clear about what we're building." The hall leaned in, sensing a critical turning point. "You built buildings with other people's money," Obama said, his voice steady and deliberate, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his argument. "I built a career with my own hard work." He paused, letting the contrast sink in. "You put your name in gold letters on glass and steel. I put my time into teaching young people how the law works so they could fight for justice and fairness." He took a step closer to the mic, his voice resonating with a quiet, profound power. "One of us is leaving something that lasts. The other is leaving logos on real estate." The room exploded. It was a clean, devastating strike that perfectly articulated the contrast everyone in the room was feeling. The cheers were deafening, echoing off the walls as people leaped to their feet, some laughing in sheer astonishment at the audacity of the line. Trump's face tightened, his jaw working as he fought to formulate a response over the noise. "Wrong! Totally wrong!" he shouted, but his words were utterly swallowed by the ovation. Obama let the moment breathe, then delivered the finishing thought as the applause began to subside, his voice cutting through the din. "Let me tell you this," he said. "Books matter, teaching matters, law matters, because without the rule of law, without education, without the people who dedicate their lives to understanding it, you don't get skyscrapers that stand safely. You don't get contracts that mean something. You don't get a democracy that functions." The applause that followed was not just for a man. It was for an idea, the idea that the invisible structures of knowledge and justice are what holds society up, far more than any physical tower. He had successfully redefined building, and in doing so, had claimed the title of the true architect. The energy in the hall was now overwhelmingly in Obama's corner, and Trump, a man allergic to being second, felt it like a physical chill. He was cornered, agitated, and losing control of the narrative he had so carefully built. In a desperate move to reclaim the room, he decided to go for the jugular, lashing out with his most potent weapon, the accusation of presidential failure. He slammed his palm against the podium, the loud thud echoing his frustration. His voice boomed, raw and personal, an attempt to wound. "You talk a big game, Barack, but what did you really do? 8 years, and what do we have to show for it? Broken promises, weakness." He jabbed a finger toward Obama. "You think that Harvard degree saved the country? It didn't save anyone. It's worthless." The attack drew a smattering of fierce applause from his most loyal supporters, but it was a fractured sound. Pockets of noise in a sea of uneasy silence. The cheers sputtered and faded quickly, like sparks failing to catch fire. Obama's demeanor shifted. The calm reflection was gone, replaced by a steely, focused intensity. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the cool, unwavering focus of a prosecutor about to present his final damning piece of evidence. He took a step closer to the mic, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of danger that sliced through the murmurs in the hall. "You want to talk about worthless, Donald?" The room went dead silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just the electric hum of 10,000 people holding their breath. Obama let the question hang in the air, a loaded weapon he had just placed on the table for all to see. "Let's talk about bankruptcies," he said, his voice cold and methodical. "Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Let's talk about the families who lost their jobs because of your deals. The contractors who went unpaid, who had to look their own children in the eye and explain why they couldn't afford groceries. The small businesses that were crushed under the weight of your success." A collective gasp swept across the audience. It was a brutal, factual counter-assault that struck at the very heart of Trump's public identity as an infallible businessman. An eruption of applause and shouts followed, a chaotic mix of shock and validation. Hands flew to mouths, jaws dropped. People stood, pointing, their faces a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. Trump's face flushed a deep red. "Lies, all lies," he barked, his voice cracking with rage. "You know it's fake. It's not true." But Obama didn't flinch. He let the cheers roll, then raised a hand slightly, quieting the crowd just enough for his follow-up. "You can call it fake all you want, Donald, but court documents don't lie. Workers who lost their paychecks don't lie." He paused, locking eyes with Trump, delivering the final, devastating moral question. "You talk about winning, but the question America has to ask is this: how many people had to lose for you to call it a win?" The words were a kill shot, an indictment not of policy, but of character. He had been attacked on his record, and he had responded by holding up a mirror to his opponents, revealing a landscape of wreckage. The convention hall was a cauldron of raw emotion, the air crackling with an energy that felt historic. Trump, cornered and furious, his face a mask of frustration, made one last desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. He was a brawler in the final round, swinging wildly, hoping for a knockout blow. "You're all being played," he yelled, his voice hoarse, gesturing wildly at the audience as if trying to break a spell. "He's a smooth talker, that's all. A performer. He's just words. I'm a doer. I'm action." It was his final desperate appeal to the gut, an attempt to frame intellect as a weakness and eloquence as a deception. Obama, however, saw the opening. He didn't see an insult. He saw a flawed premise, and he stepped forward to correct it. Not for Trump, but for everyone listening. He leaned in, his voice quieter now, but with a clarity that seemed to command the very air in the room. "Words matter, Donald," he said, his tone turning from combative to instructive. "The Constitution is just words, but those words shape everything we stand for. The Bible is just words, but those words guide millions of souls. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used words to move a nation and bend the arc of history toward justice. Don't you dare tell me words don't matter." The applause was immediate and heartfelt. "The problem, Donald," Obama continued, his voice steady, "isn't words. The problem is when you use them to divide instead of unite, to wound instead of to heal." The atmosphere was thick with a final, unbearable tension. The entire night, every exchange, every argument, had been building to this single, precipitous moment. Obama took a small step back, his gaze sweeping across the entire hall, from the front rows to the very back, as if to make every single person a witness to the verdict he was about to deliver. "You can call books weak," he began, each phrase a steady, rhythmic beat, a drum roll for the final judgment. "You can call education worthless. You can even try to laugh at my degree." He paused, letting the silence hang, before locking his eyes directly on Trump, his gaze piercing and unyielding. "But here is the truth, Donald. When history writes its final chapter about us, they won't remember the size of your buildings." He leaned in, delivering the final devastating line with a calm, quiet finality. "They'll remember the size of your character, and that is something no bank can loan you, no lawsuit can win you, and no inheritance can buy you." The hall didn't just applaud. It detonated. An explosion of sound, cheers, stomps, whistles, and screams erupted as one. People were on their feet, hugging strangers, their faces alight with a profound sense of catharsis. The ovation was a physical force, a tidal wave that completely and utterly washed away Trump's presence. He stood there, mouth agape, shouting words no one could hear. A king dethroned in his own court. The cameras zoomed in on his face, flushed, tight-lipped, and for the first time, utterly defeated. Then they cut to Obama, who stood calmly, hands folded, having won the night not by shouting louder, but by speaking a truth that resonated in the soul of the room. The explosion of sound was not just applause, it was a verdict, a standing ovation that felt less like a political endorsement and more like a profound moral affirmation. For a long moment, the hall was a single, roaring entity, a tidal wave of sound that had completely and utterly washed away the last remnants of Trump's control. He stood frozen behind his podium, a monument to his own defeat, his face a tight mask of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth, but no words could escape the deafening roar. He had built his career on commanding the room, and now, in his own arena, he had been rendered utterly silent. Across the stage, Obama didn't gloat. He didn't pump his fist or raise his voice. He simply took a small step back from the microphone, his hands folded, and let the moment stand on its own. He stood with the quiet authority of a man whose point needed no further defense, his composure a final, stark contrast to the agitated figure opposite him. The moderators, looking stunned themselves, finally moved to wrap up the event, their voices barely audible over the remaining cheers. Trump made a hasty retreat, muttering words swallowed by the noise as he disappeared backstage, leaving the stage to his opponent. Obama, in contrast, took a slow, deliberate walk, shaking hands with the moderators, offering a small, knowing nod to the audience before he, too, departed. As people filed out into the cool Arizona night, the usual post-rally buzz was replaced by something more thoughtful, more subdued. Strangers spoke to one another, not about who won, but about what they had felt. "I came here expecting fireworks," a man in a Phoenix Suns jersey told a local reporter, shaking his head in awe. "I didn't think I'd end up with a lesson on what it means to be a good man." Even one of Trump's staunchest supporters, a man in a red cap who had been cheering loudly at the start, admitted quietly to his friend, "I'll always back Trump, but I gotta give it to him." He handled himself cool as ice. He never lost it. By the time people reached the parking lot, the digital world was already ablaze. Clips of the character line were viral, replayed millions of times. Headlines were already written, dominating the news cycle. Obama silences Trump with masterclass in dignity. The night character trumped towers. The narrative was set, not by media spin, but by the raw, undeniable power of the moment itself. What lingered long after the lights went down was not the anger of the conflict, but the clarity of the moral. Obama hadn't just defended his degree. He had defended an idea, the idea that our worth is not defined by our wealth or our volume, but by our integrity and the legacy we build within other people. The final question that hung in the Arizona night was not about who had won the exchange, but about what people chose to carry forward from it. Insults are temporary, but character is eternal. Towers can crumble, empires can fall, but the impact you have on others is what truly endures. In the noisy, chaotic theater of modern life, true strength doesn't need to shout. It speaks with the quiet, unshakable authority of truth.